Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are so delighted for our next guest, Dr. Jennifer Dresden. She is a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, where she helps teams leverage leading social science research to inform their work in defense of democracy. She was previously a member of the faculty and the associate director of the Democracy and Government program at Georgetown University. She's a leading voice on democracy and authoritarian politics, and what a wonderful time to be having this conversation. And she is here today to discuss a report she co-authored for Protect Democracy titled The Authoritarian Playbook, How Reporters Can Contextualize and Cover Authoritarian Threats as Distinct from Politics as Usual. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you so much for joining us on WCPT.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, all right, maybe we start by diving in and start with a big picture look at the authoritarian playbook. Can you tell us a little bit about the report and why you thought it was so important to focus in specifically on what newsrooms and the media more broadly can do to cover the sort of anti-democratic elements within the United States?
Sure. So there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about American democracy being in danger. And in general, I think that people recognize that, right? Pretty much any poll that's asked Americans whether they're worried about the health of our democracy over the last few years, the vast majority, 60, 70, sometimes even say like 80%, say that they are concerned, right? They're concerned about the direction our democracy is going. They're concerned about the health of our democracy. But the U.S. isn't alone in having challenges in that area. There's been a global wave of democratic backsliding over the last 15 to 20 years. And when we take a broader view, we can see that democracies aren't collapsing all at once, and instead they're kind of eroding bit by bit over time. So they all have that in common. But also there's a lot of commonality in the types of things that are contributing to that erosion. We call these the 7 tactics of the authoritarian playbook, and you really see them play out again and again around the world. But to the second part of your question, we specifically wrote the report to be a resource for media because covering this for journalists is actually really, really hard. A lot of the things that would fall under those tactics, they might seem technical or isolated or wonky or even just kind of the same old politics. But if the media can't put these things in context, the public won't recognize what's going on until it's too late. But at the same time, when you're on a deadline and you have 800 words or 2 minutes to cover some of these stories, you don't exactly have time to sit down and read like a bookshelf worth of background. So we tried to put all of this into a format and a resource that journalists could actually use.
That's so interesting because, in academics, we've got lots of time to think about and study democracy. But if you're working as a journalist, you don't have that same sort of time. It has to be immediate. And it's really useful to be able to think about these things as, okay, here's what I need to be watching for and here's what I need to be responding to.
Yeah, exactly. It's really not easy. It is a tough job. And so this report was intended to be a resource to help with that, really.
So, part of the reason why it feels like this is so challenging is, you mentioned this in your first response there. You say in the report that authoritarian takeovers rarely happen overnight, and that the authoritarian playbook is a process that happens piecemeal and is hard to distinguish from normal political jockeying. And you talk about this idea of salami tactics, and I feel like this is part of the challenge is that the way that people are chipping away at democracy plays out in this kind of unique way. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by salami tactics and maybe, give us some examples of that?
Sure. So I mentioned before that we see 7 tactics that are used commonly around the world. That includes things that would-be authoritarians do, like politicizing independent institutions or aggrandizing executive power, really attacking checks and balances, spreading disinformation, corrupting elections, quashing dissent, targeting vulnerable communities and stoking violence, in service of this broader, this broader pattern. And what we mean by the salami tactics is that any one of these things on its own might not be enough to do real damage to our democracy. But they build on one another. And over time, what we see happen is that the health of the system gets weaker and weaker so that something that, our democracy might be resilient to, right? An attempt to expand executive power in one area could be checked by some of these other things. But over time, the system weakens in ways that sort of feedback loop doesn't kick in. So, for example, if you're an executive looking to take power and bit by bit you can squeeze out the space for opposition in the press or in civil society, you might then have kind of the wiggle room and the ability to politicize the judiciary, which should be independent, and do that without noise or fuss, and then it's no longer independent. And then you can ensure favorable rulings, right? If anyone tries to challenge your then subsequent efforts to sideline the legislature and claim more executive power, right? So these things kind of build on each other over time. And it's not any one specific thing that happens or any one specific move that we could point to say, yes, that's the moment. That's when democracy collapsed. But this series of actions kind of accumulates over time, and the protections and rights and checks and balances that a democracy relies on all kind of wither away over time.
If only there were, an example someplace in the world where this is playing out right now. That would be...
Well, it's sort of sneaky, right? I mean, it was a lot easier when just with men and with guns showed up and ended democracy. It's very different, that process today. Now, in the report, you talk about that threats to democracy, the press needs to distinguish between normal political jockeying and genuine authoritarian moves. Can you tell us, how do you understand the difference between them? You're sort of hinting at that, but how do you, if you're in the press, how do you start realizing what's one versus the other?
Yeah, I mean, look, democracy is messy, right? There is no way to get millions of people with all kinds of different experiences and ideas to live together and solve problems together. It's not going to look like a prim and proper Tea Party. American democracy in particular is boisterous, right? We expect competition. We expect people who want to lead the country to compete hard for that office. And our system certainly has always been imperfect, and there are always politicians who will try to push the boundaries. So we need ways to tell the difference between the rough and tumble, flawed system that we've had, and when that's just kind of doing what it does, and things that are actually pushing us closer towards a system that we couldn't even plausibly call democratic anymore. So there's a set of questions that we can ask ourselves, and that in the report we encourage journalists to ask themselves when they're writing their stories. And the first is whether something we're looking at is part of the playbook at all, right? We identify these 7 tactics precisely for that reason. And that's, an important threshold question. But even once we agree that something seems like it's in the playbook, we can ask ourselves 3 additional questions to see whether it's something new, right? Does this line up with modern precedent or not? Now, not all precedents are good precedent. Like we've got to be very clear about that.
Yes.
Definitely not all good precedent. But it's a good first test to say, is this kind of politics as usual? Have we seen this happening for a long time? Or is this new? Is it different? Is it pushing the boundaries further? Second, how intensely or extensively is it happening? Is this just one loose cannon who's trying to push the boundaries? Or is this happening again and again and again? Or is it happening in a really intense way? Then we know sort of systemically we might have a problem. And then third, and this is really important, how are others in the system responding, right? Are political allies stepping up to sort of reinforce the guardrails and say, actually, you can't do that? Or are they enabling or permitting this type of behavior, or allowing this type of action to go forward, maybe even enabling it? Because if they're enabling it, that's when we see that the system really isn't self-correcting, and that's when we would say, okay, the quality of democracy is actually moving at this point.
So let me ask a follow-up on that real quick then, because I was reading your report on Monday as we went through Inauguration Day, and one of the things you mentioned in here is that in relation to this, particularly with executive power, right, this sort of decades-long shift towards executive power, and how much of this is normal versus how much is this something different. And I was reading that as I watched Donald Trump sign 100 executive orders on all of these different things. So using that as sort of an example, can you talk about how should the media talk about something like Monday? How do you make distinguish that from, or is it different than sort of other presidents signing executive orders, for instance?
Yeah, I think this is where having that background and that context is really helpful, and it's important to put this in context, right? So presidents signing executive orders, we know that that has increased over time. We've seen more and more of those. But the types of executive orders we see, for example, where there are differences there, the volume of them, where there are differences there, to be able to put that in context for people so that people understand the background, and people who are maybe inclined to sort of dismiss this as, this is just normal politics. This is, what people do, can kind of see where the difference lies, right?
That's interesting. Okay, so while you're really focusing on the media, as political scientists, we sort of read this with a broader lens, and the findings lend themselves to anybody who cares about democracy. Even the name itself, I love the name itself, the authoritarian playbook, nothing new. The tactics that we see in the United States, we tend to think there's something unique about what's happening here. But you guys are arguing that this is part of a broader pattern, that Donald Trump represents something that's happening across the globe. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this as part of a broader pattern that we need to be thinking about, not just in the United States, but globally? We're seeing candidates who are pushing the boundaries of democracy.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, in the United States, we love to think about our politics as being exceptional, and in some ways they are. But we have seen this backsliding going on around the globe for almost 20 years, really. And that ranges from Hungary to Turkey to India, and the circumstances are certainly unique in each country. The particular local politics are distinct. But one of the reasons why I think it's so important to highlight these commonalities is because we can really pay attention to them. We can understand and perhaps even in some cases anticipate what might come down the road. And I think that that's really helpful to be able to do for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to give the impression that this process requires some grand chess master level strategy. Right. The accumulation of these things sometimes does not necessarily have to be based in any strategy or intention, right? Some of these sort of salami slices can be bumbling, but the effect still accumulates over time. So knowing that and being able to look around the world and see how things have played out, I think is very important. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that there is dissatisfaction or discontent with democracy in lots of places, worry about democracy in lots of places. But I think looking at this global pattern can also lead us to remember that it's really important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that even where there's a need for reform, even where there's a clear desire for reform, there are ways to go about that will strengthen democracy in the long run. And there are ways that will have the opposite effect.
This is really
fascinating. Bill and I have talked about that, about the tendency that people's frustration with democracy is actually often mostly a frustration with a specific type of democracy or specific issue in democracy. I think that's fantastic.
We need to take a quick break, but we will be right back to talk more about the authoritarian playbook with Jennifer Dresden in just a second.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are talking with Dr. Jennifer Dresden, who is the co-author of The Authoritarian Playbook, and we're kind of sort of kicking around democracy and authoritarianism. Phil, I think you were up. You wanted to ask another question. Why don't you take off?
Yeah. So before the break, you've kind of touched on this, and I was going to say hinted, but more than hinted. In the report you talk about authoritarians tend to employ the same 7 basic tactics, and you kind of went through some of those. Politicizing independent institutions, spreading disinformation, aggrandizing executive power, quashing dissent, scapegoating communities, vulnerable communities, corrupting elections, stoking violence. You also talked about how it's not always necessarily strategic. It's often sort of bumbling. And all of this makes me think of Donald Trump, right? I mean, this is like you're going through this list of sort of Trumpian tactics or approaches to politics. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how much of a risk do you see currently in the American system as we enter a second Trump administration in terms of, the warning signs you point to in this report?
Look, I think the risks are very real. And I say that because this is a process in the United States that has been going on for a while now. If you look at the data and if you look at sort of the big data sets that rate the quality of democracy of countries around the world, they have slightly different points for when they say that democratic backsliding in the United States began. But some of them rated as early as like 2011, right? That the quality of our democracy has been backsliding over time. And so the risk in this moment is occurring sort of in that context. And, I think we can look at promises that were made over the last 2 years during the campaign period and prior. We can look at the election denialism that led to January 6th. We can look at some of the actions that have been taken even just this week. And it doesn't take a lot to see how some of this does line up with, the playbook, right? Where we see real risks of politicizing institutions, where we see scapegoating of vulnerable communities. And so I do think that the risk is real. And also, though, we should be clear that this isn't singularly only about one person, right? Norms are kind of like Humpty Dumpty, right? Once they're broken, they're really tough to put back together again. And so that's another piece that I think we have to keep in mind as we approach this period and really think about how important it is to safeguard the core elements of our democracy.
I really like that. Norms as Humpty Dumpty, right? It's really important to think about that. And as you were talking about that, and as we was thinking through the report as well, it occurred to me that a lot of the other leaders in these countries that are also experiencing some democratic backsliding, they share a sense of affection for each other. I mean, you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines going back a while, and Donald Trump. Bolsonaro in Brazil, they all seem to like each other and appreciate how they play politics. And as I was listening to it, it makes me think that's not a good sign, but it also is eroding these norms, right? Is there an element of authoritarian learning? I mean, are these individuals reflecting on what each other's doing, and do they have their own version of the playbook, do you think, that is sort of shaping how they approach the media and democracy more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, look, it isn't great. But when it comes to foreign policy, look, leaders find ways to work with each other and build relationships for all sorts of reasons. So I'm not going to be Pollyanna-ish over here and suggest that no American president has ever forged a strong relationship with an autocrat. I mean, it wouldn't be accurate. But this question of learning in countries that are experiencing backsliding, we definitely do see that there's a little bit of imitation is the sincerest form of flattery going on. So just one example that we could throw out there, and this is a more sort of international example, but in 2012-ish, Vladimir Putin pioneered using foreign funding laws to just absolutely decimate pro-democracy civil society in Russia. So put in place these sort of seemingly technical bureaucratic laws that went after organizations that received support from international donors. Similar laws have been adopted by other countries again and again as a way of quashing dissent through this seemingly technocratic or bureaucratic enforcement. And so that's just one example of how you can use these moves in ways that others may emulate, right? Over time, it does happen.
That's interesting.
So I'm thinking about maybe the breakdown. I've been stuck in my head, the breakdown of norms, and you were talking about that. The thing that Bill and I we do our podcast, and when we talked this week about Inauguration Day and what stood out to us, the thing that I think for both of us we found the most shocking was the pardoning of everyone related to January 6th. And I think about, to some extent, I mean, this is, again, I think this could tie in with the sort of authoritarian learning, but it certainly ties into norms, political violence, all sorts of other stuff. I'm wondering, what was your reaction as you saw that play out? And does that have implications both for democracy, but also, I know you do some work with political violence as well. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are as you process that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is an area where it's a pretty clearly bad for democracy move, right? This was a blanket pardon, including for individuals who are convicted of violent crimes. in, a due process, and not meted out in the interests of justice and mercy, which is historically what the pardon power has been intended for. And it also, goes even a step beyond what we've seen. There's been some political science research on the use of the pardon over the last 30 years, and how over the last 30 years, we've seen some sort of creeping on it being used for more sort of personal or political purposes. But this went even a step beyond that, right? And so it is deeply concerning.
So Phil mentioned that you also, one of your other areas of expertise is political violence and democracy. And you have, it's really, our listeners should go check this out. It's called the Violence and Democracy Impact Tracker. Can you tell us what the data is telling you about violence and democracy trends in the United States? And obviously, like the January 6th pardons are probably not going to help some of those data points. But what are you seeing when you look at these broad patterns?
Yeah, so the Violence and Democracy Impact Tracker, or VDIT, because that's a mouthful. VDIT is a survey of political violence experts from around the world who we have asked quarterly over the last year and a half or so how much of an impact they think political violence is having on different areas of democracy in the United States. So we're not asking them how often does it happen. We're asking them how much is it affecting the health of democracy. And one thing that's been really notable is that their assessments have actually been pretty consistent for a year and a half now. That the average level of concern comes out around a 2.5 on a scale of 5, which is meaningless on its own. But what that means, based on the questions we're asking them, is essentially that the impact that we're seeing political violence, harassment, threats, the impact that we're seeing it have on democracy in the United States is not normal. This is not normal for a well-functioning democracy. And that it is raising, for many of them, they see it as raising the risk of greater democratic breakdown in the future. But they do not see that breakdown from political violence as being imminent, which I think is a really, really important piece of this picture, because what that means is that we have time, not a ton of time, but we have time to turn this ship around, to not go down that path. And I think that is really, really important for people to understand, that the risk is real, that people should be, attentive to this issue. Also, but that this is the time to act, to counter the role that violence, threats, harassment are playing in our democracy.
Fascinating. So I'll ask the hard question, I guess. This is so Bill and I mean, we wrestle with this idea as well. So you've talked about, we have time to turn this around. You talked about, once norms are broken, they're not easily rebuilt. And it feels like, it's easy to feel kind of helpless or hopeless in this. And so you've written this about the media, but again, Bill and I haven't come up with necessarily great answers to this as well. But what's to the average American, what do you do? What do we do to strengthen some of these norms, or are we powerless? How do you fit into this bigger picture, I guess?
Yeah, we absolutely are not powerless. I think that is so important to emphasize in conversations like these. First, because again, when we look globally, there are countries that have turned this process around, right, that have stopped it in its tracks. So we know that. We also know that there are a ton of things that people can do in their families, in their local communities, to contribute to a re-strengthening of our democracy. And if I can sort of put a plug, if you go to our website at protectdemocracy.org, there's an entire list of things that people can do within their communities, within their towns, their cities, their families, their friends, that can help contribute towards really reinvigorating our democracy in a way that we would be having a very, very different conversation in a few years, hopefully.
Maybe we can wrap up with one final question about the role of the media and the challenge of covering Trump is just so complex. It's so hard. I think the media often does a really good job of trying to do that. And we've seen a bunch of different approaches. How do you assess how well the media has done? What do they do well? What do they need to be better about as we're entering Trump 2.0? What sort of advice would you give to those listening who are thinking about how the media can be better?
Yeah, I think I have to start by saying that a lot of media have actually done tremendous work in offering this kind of context and the type of context I discussed before. And I think that continuing to do that, continuing to offer that kind of context is just really vital. Outlets with the resources to do it have gone as far as setting up dedicated democracy desks, right, which focus exclusively on these kinds of issues. And that's been great. The two areas where I would say, there are bigger concerns and people should be attentive to is first the ecosystem of local media. Local and regional media is just so tough right now. And local and regional papers and news outlets, they don't have those kinds of resources. There's so much pressure on them right now, and they can't invest in having reporters exclusively on a democracy beat, right? It's a real shame. But, to that, one of the things we hoped for with the Playbook report is that it would be a resource for exactly those journalists who don't necessarily have the full support system for this kind of analysis. And the second thing that I think we need to keep an eye on is the risk of what scholars and others have called anticipatory obedience. So that we've seen some outlets signal that they're willing to pull critical pieces or try to avoid any kind of controversy, to try to avoid running afoul of those in power. And internationally, we see that, right? That is part of this process too. It's part of quashing dissent, right? It's easier to quash dissent if the threat itself is enough. And that kind of self-censorship is understandable, but it's also very bad for democracy.